Hello, everyone. This is Sofia Smallstorm welcoming you to the Speed of Light show on Pure Momentum Network. I took a short break for a couple of weeks and I was covered by two people, both called Peter. Very interesting and pure coincidence. I hope you enjoyed those shows. I would like to let you know that Pure Momentum has a YouTube channel now where the first hour is being uploaded on a fairly regular basis. Not every show, but the more different shows with different content, samples of the different hosts. So I would urge you to go there, and those are easy links to send around to your friends to introduce them to Pure Momentum. And of course, please do urge them to become subscribers. We want this network to grow and introduce more hosts and more topics to the whole world. So today I have a guest whose name is Zoe. Zoe is a very unique person, let's say. She is very smart, very articulate. Now she's going to blush and refuse to.
Fortunately, you can't see that aspect.
Right, we can't see it. But anyway, I met Zoe a number of years ago in and through the truth movement, this thing we call the truth movement, which isn't always about truth. Sometimes it's about limited hangout. Sometimes it's about controlled opposition. Zoe has a very different background, and she will tell you about that. We're going to discuss the occultic nature of the elite today, the occultic nature of the New Age movement, ritual abuse, and certain industries involved in these methodologies and these subjects. So this may be painful for some, it may be engrossing. I hope we all come away with an expanded understanding. Zoe's voice has not really been heard, and she will explain why. So with that, I would like to bring in Zoe. How are you?
I'm doing great, Sophia, and I really thank you for an opportunity to express some things that it's been a frustrating avenue for me to be told to be quiet, or we shan't talk about that kind of thing. So thank you for a platform to be able to say what's been on my mind and what I've observed through personal experience and this crazy world that we're in right now.
Well, you're very welcome, and I hope you get a bigger platform from this point on. Why don't we just start at what you think is the beginning? You can tell us a little bit about where this all began and how.
Okay, I think, not to be contrary, but I think I might start in the middle because it kind of paints a picture of how I became aware of what had happened in my early life and the degree to which my life had been manipulated from behind the scenes. So for me, the awakening process began in 2002. It was about a year after 9/11, which I, like most people, knew from the very beginning was a false flag operation. When I saw the buildings coming down, it was as clear as could be to me that was a controlled demolition. As to how it was brought about, I don't know. There's so many contradictory theories out there. All I know is that, to my core, they did this, just like I knew they had done Oklahoma. There's always been a part of me that recognized that the government was evil on so many levels, even from a small child, just not being able to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I would stand there and mumble a bunch of things, but I knew that whatever I was pledging to was not something I was in alignment with. So after 2002, I was in a remote place up in Northern California. I was caretaking a property for an old Vietnam vet that used to go to India every year. And there were a lot of vets that lived up in that area that had become reclusive. And I was one of the few people up there that had internet. And I had started to do research about skull and bones as I had started to understand that there was a dark aspect to this agenda, that it wasn't just like bad people doing things for monetary reasons or power, that there was actually, some kind of sorcery involved in all this. So I started researching skull and bones, and a lot of the guys up in the area started coming around and listening to different YouTube videos and things that were exposing the occultic nature of 9/11 and our government. Excuse me. So I was involved in trying to expose that. And one night I went to bed, and I lived at the end of a dirt road, at the end of a dirt road, at the end of a dirt road. You didn't pass by my house on your way to anywhere. You had to specifically drive there. And I was laying in bed, and I saw a white government truck drive down it was a full moon, so it was very light outside. And I could see that it was one of those big white government trucks with the government license plate. And I remember looking at the candle, and the candle split into these vortexes of light. And I remember thinking, this isn't going to be good. And that was the last memory I had until, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 days later, but it was days later. I woke up face down in a creek. It was about 20 degrees outside. And I had injection marks on my arm. And I had no idea what had transpired, but I knew that it wasn't good. And I got in my car and packed up my things and took off down I-5. And it was the first time that I had become aware that I was having thoughts that weren't my thoughts. I was having the thought, drive into the bridge abutment. But I wasn't suicidal, and I wasn't depressed. I was confused about a lot of things that had happened. But in the moment of coming back into form, because I think I was officially dead for a short amount of time, and when I came to, I glanced at a piece of grass that had dew on it. And again, the vortex of light kind of split out. And in that second, I had about 6 million thoughts, more thoughts than you could have in that amount of time. And a lot of gaps were filled in. There was little images of pieces of my life that didn't make any sense that all got filled in. And I knew at that point what I was dealing with, that I was dealing with mind control and fugue states, times when I wasn't truly present. So I was driving down I-5 when I had the thought to drive into a bridge abutment. And I had the realization that that wasn't my thought, and that thought was coming from an external source. And I ignored it. And I got to LA, and I have a sister that lives here in LA, which is where I am now. And she's the least likely person in my family that I would have thought would understand and comprehend this sort of thing, but she was the closest. And I knew I needed I needed to get out of the middle of nowhere and get among people as quickly as I could. And so when I first arrived, I told her that I was willing to accept the fact that I was crazy, but that I thought that I had been being drugged and abducted by the CIA all my life. And she looked at me with a pretty pained expression, and she's like, well, we'll get you some help. But then she said, and why do you think this? So I started feeding her little bits of information, and I showed her the injection marks on my arms. And she knew that I was not a drug user or a person that had a lifestyle that, that would lead to ending up face down in a creek. She and I were in contact fairly often, so she didn't question my sanity, but, that is a lot to dump on somebody. And so she, being a data architect, she looks at things from a very structural level. And so she wanted to know about documentation. And I knew that some paperwork had been released in the Clinton years regarding the MK Ultra mind control experiments, which are also very much tied into COINTELPRO. I don't think people realize how closely tied those two things are. But she started reading the documentation. She ordered it. She didn't read anything on the internet. She ordered it through the Freedom of Information Act because she wanted to make sure that she wasn't reading a bunch of nonsense. And so after about 2 days, she came home from work in tears, and she said, oh my gosh, this is true, because she realized that my father met all the markers for the people that were involved in this kind of thing. There was kind of a certain career path back in the 50s. He was a pioneer in the computing industry and had worked as a consultant for IBM and secret clearance in the Navy and in the post office that in Memphis, there's these hub cities that are actually on the 33rd parallel, like Atlanta and Memphis, which ties into their occultic structures. But Memphis was a hub for a lot of this stuff, especially Scottish Rite. The post office was sort of the equivalent of Google in the sense that that was the biggest tracking agency that was available at the time. They were the people that knew where everybody was, and they were also one of the first agencies to get into automation and computers in a huge way. So that was my father's early career path, was in that sort of thing. And then he was later recruited into foreign service, and he worked for all the alphabet agencies like AID. We lived overseas a lot. And these were the people that were chosen because of the fact that you're a little bit more isolated when you're overseas. And that's where all the black funds come from, all the dark money that's coming in is through these agencies that are basically just different ways of spelling CIA. So she believed me, which was, the first in a row, because I had talked about this to certain people. And even I initially didn't believe myself, because I remember the first time that I told a particular story about being recruited during the Watergate break-in. And I was telling this to some friends of mine over some wine. And I woke up the next day just hating myself, going, why did you make up that story? Why did you lie to these people about being in the Watergate break-in and all these things? And then I asked myself, well, what part wasn't true? And all of it was true, but I was so ingrained to not talk about it, to not make these associations, that even when I would tell people initially about these things, I would tell myself, why are you lying? Why are you making all this stuff up? And it's because, you're so ingrained to not tell the truth. And what you have is dual realities. Like when I said that I came to realize things when I woke up in the creek, the gaps were filled in where I would get like an image of a different memory of the same event. And that made no sense to me. It's like, well, which one is true? If you have false memories or screen memories, how do you know which reality is the real reality? And
so let me ask you a question here. Are you describing a split self, alters, compartmentalized?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fugue states, basically.
So your expression fugue states parallels the alter, ALTER, alter selves that we read about in Kathy O'Brien's book and other people who've been through this MK Ultra program. Yeah. So I just for my sake, because I always like to wind up on loose ends, what did you do when you woke up in the creek? And what year was that again? And what was the first thing you did? How did you get back?
Well, it was 2002. Yeah. And as I said, I woke up and I was in the creek and I was half frozen to death. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I wasn't supposed to live through that experience. And I knew I needed to get out of there because I was very remote, very cut off from the world, and the internet connection and the phone had both been taken out. The line came down a dirt road. It just laid on the ground. It wasn't very high tech. And it had either been severed or chewed through by an animal, but nothing worked. The telephone didn't work. So at first when I initially came to, all I wanted to do was take a shower, number one, to warm up, and also because I felt really befouled. And so I couldn't get there was a gas tank that you had to change over because everything was off the grid back where I lived. And so I was trying to do that, and I was just in tears. I was crying and crying and crying, and my hands were too numb to do it. And a neighbor of mine showed up, and he changed it over. And I took a really hot shower, and then I just got in my car and started driving to LA.
So the creek you recognized the area, it was near where you lived?
Oh, it was on my property, not my property. Again, I used to caretake this property for somebody that went to India every year. So I was familiar with the neighbors and the property, but it was very remote and off the grid.
So you had been left for dead, you're assuming. Right. And it's a good thing they didn't cart you off somewhere very far away where you had no you would have no infrastructure. You wouldn't even have known where to go, and you would have been stumbling around, you know?
Exactly. And that did occur to me. I did feel, having survived that, plus some of the other things that we'll get to, I did feel and always have felt that I had some sort of divine protection going on, that although these horrific things were happening, that there was some level of protection coming from something or some, which, you know, I don't even pretend to understand it all, but I did feel like that I was meant to die, but I was kept alive. And at the time, I felt I was kept alive to expose this after 10 years of being unable to get anybody to even want to listen to it. You know, I begin to doubt that, but I do feel that I have information that people need to know, because I think, you know, with all of the emphasis on the Miley Cyruses and the people coming out of Disney that are mind controlled, the celebrities, or what, people have the impression that this is only something that happens in the elite, and they don't understand that these programs were introduced by the CIA back in the 50s, and that their own paperwork estimates that in one way or another they screwed with 1% of the population. So it's not just famous people, it's everyday individuals that were targeted for different levels of mind control experimentation.
Right, and these are the cases that they practice on and track and
absolutely
collate the failures and non-failures and the bleeding through. So it was really very recently that you began to be able to figure out that you had this fragmented past. And can you give us some idea of how old you are?
Right, I'm 60. How's that for a good idea?
All right. Some people.
So I was born in 1953, which was a banner year for this experimentation. And some things about this I know beyond a doubt, and other things I surmise. And I surmise that I was a victim at birth. I don't have much proof of that, other than the fact that my time of birth was not written down on my birth certificate. And that's like a really crucial thing, especially among the occultists, because they're so into astrology. The time of birth is essential, but the fact that it wasn't recorded leads me to believe that perhaps I was deflected into another area of the hospital. But 53 was a banner year for their experimentations on giving children LSD, which I believe was a major factor in the drugging and the mind control. In my case, not with everybody, but certainly with me, because of the hallucinations and the paranormal experiences that I had as a very young child. I tend to think that it was probably based on hallucinogenic drugs. But to kind of move forward in time, I was one of 5 kids, and I had 3 sisters that were very close in age. We were like all 18 months apart. We had an innate ability to sing 3-part harmony, which we discovered by accident. My dad was taking us on vacation, and we're driving down the highway, and we just started singing a song automatically in 3-part harmony. And I was like 3. My other sisters were 5 and 7. And my dad pulled off the road and he goes, "Do that again." And we did. And so they thought we were gifted and started entering us into talent shows and putting us on TV shows and fashion shows, and which is that's the avenue that this ring of occultic pedophiles use. They want to be where the kids are, so they don't infiltrate these organizations; they create them, and it's all top down. So we were always in these situations where we were in these different events and backstage. And one of the shows that I was on was a television show in Memphis, and the host was a well-known philanthropist, and I'll leave his name out. He's no longer living. I saw his gravestone at the Beth Israel Temple Cemetery in Memphis. But he had this television show, and he also had a toy store in Memphis at 666 Beale Street, which burned down on Christmas Eve. And he gained acclaim for a puppet that he had designed and made famous. That, oddly enough, happened to have 2 horns, little horns. But I was on this TV show, and there was a photograph that right after 9/11, when I was starting to understand what had happened with me, I examined that photograph with a different eye, and I realized that it was a clearly Masonically posed photograph. I'm sitting on his lap. There's another girl that is standing next to him. He has his arm around her, and there's several other children in the picture, one of which is my sister. But he's wearing a black and white checked sweater. There's a pyramid shaped stage prop right in back of his head with a light at the top of it, sort of, sun symbolization. And the girl that he has his arm around, and myself, we both have our lips pursed in a Masonic pose that means our lips are sealed. And I have my hands in a position which is known in Tai Chi as holding the light, but it stems from the Masonic teachings of holding the light of Lucifer. So this photograph, when I looked at it and saw, like in an instant, all of this stuff, then I started to realize that this was very highly organized. And in other incidents that would happen, we were involved in a singing program that met at different schools on Saturdays. And everybody met in this big auditorium, and they would divide us up into groups, and we would learn songs from different countries. But there was 5 of us that always got taken out of that auditorium, and my sisters were in a different age group, so they didn't notice that we were all leaving. But we would be duck walked down this hallway with a man in the front and a woman in back, excuse me, and then the 5 children. And I remember that every time I got to the bulletin board where they would post the grades that the students had, I would always look at the bulletin board and go, this isn't going to be good. And I would just leave. Myself, who I am, would just leave. And that's what you were referring to with the altered states. And I used to hear people talk about that, not having memories or split self. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. If something happens to you, you know it. You can't not remember things. But I'm here to tell you that you can absolutely not remember things. And fortunately, there is a mechanism which allows us to escape when we're about to experience trauma. I'm thankful that I don't remember in detail. I've had glimpses into it. Like I said, in waking up in the creek, I had just enough. It was almost like a movie being played at some super fast speed, where you had these frozen frames of incidents that you goes, oh, I see that was what was happening behind the scenes.
So Zoe, when you were aware that there was a government van driving down the dirt road in 2002, and you mentioned that the candle broke into all these vortices of light, was that you going into your defense stage, or were they doing something to you that caused the candle to fragment like that, and that transported you somewhere else?
I don't really know, to be honest with you, because that theme had presented itself in so many different ways. Like I got into a lot of occult type things, which I didn't realize were occultic. That I fell hook, line, and sinker for the New Age thing, and I used to do candle meditations where the same thing would happen. The candles would split, and they would start resonating to my voice. If I was chanting or talking, the vortices from the candle would literally go 10 feet in the air. And if I walked in a circle, they would follow me, and I would direct them into my heart in this New Age type of self-invented meditation I was doing. So I don't know. I don't know if they were benign or if they're tied in. Some things I'll just never know, but I know they were a part of it somehow.
So the meditations that you just described were done kind of in your midlife. These were things that you were learning about and experimenting with just out of curiosity, right? They weren't part of any kind of organized program.
Well, that's hard to say. I don't think they were, but it's all organized in the sense that, I was a person that was always seeking the truth. And I was also a person that I have a very deep commitment to and level of compassion. I have always just absolutely despised the concept of war and killing, and I guess I had a clean consciousness in spite of what was going on around me. So when I was introduced to the concept of transcendental meditation, I thought, well, yeah, who doesn't want peace in their life and harmony and for us all to get along? And so hook, line, and sinker, I went along with that program. And as I started to do research about it later and found out who popularized this technique and why, because we were told at the time that this was just a technique like brushing your teeth, and that it's sort of like taking out the mental trash. And they said there was no philosophy involved in it, but it's nonsense, because there's all kinds of secret occultic parts of the initiation thing. You're told to bring a white handkerchief and a piece of fruit, and you're told your mantra in secrecy and not to ever speak it. And it turns out that these mantras are based on these frequencies, these sounds, where you're incanting the names of these underworld deities in something that's clearly a philosophy. So I was taken in by all these things, and also the Beatles were into it, and they were promoting it. They had Marishi Yogi on their Sgt. Pepper's album along with Aleister Crowley. But these things at the time were, I was doing them from a purist stance, but they're, and looking back and doing the research, they were purely occultic. So what I feel is that while you think that you're taking out your trash and doing this good spiritual work, your energies are being used by nefarious for nefarious reasons. It's a trap, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this New Age involvement in the occultism. A lot of people don't realize that Scottish Rite magazine was called Scottish Rite magazine until 1986, and then they changed their name to New Age magazine. So people think that this is new thought and New Age, and there's nothing new about it. It all goes back to the Masonic teachings are based on the ancient mystery schools. And so these are practices that have been repopularized and brought into our everyday culture, but they don't come from a pure source at all.
So you're basically suggesting, or perhaps saying outright, that all of this meditation, the way that we're taught in the West, that we must, meditate to relieve stress, and then they have group meditations and various different, there are all these churches that have cropped up, these New Age churches. So the practice of meditating in that manner, emptying your mind out, allows your mind to be, your energy to be seized in some way?
I absolutely believe that. I do. Because I have all these friends that, they say, if I don't meditate, you don't want to know me. But then you look at their life. I have a friend in particular that, both her and her husband, they wouldn't miss their meditations. But if you look at their life, one week he drove off the road and broke his legs. She fell down the stairs and broke her arm. Their house was being foreclosed on. Their daughter defaulted on student loans, and they came after their property. So if these practices were in fact enhancing your life, and all this other peripheral things wouldn't be going on. And I got to say that the minute I stopped meditating, I would never introduce a mantra into my mind again. I guess I practice a form of meditation in terms of quieting my mind, but I basically focus on a feeling of like a love vibration. But even that, I have to be careful, because even using the word vibration, these people that are into promoting these practices, they totally understand frequencies and vibrations, which is what mantras are. So, and words themselves have been used against us. The Luciferians, they love word plays. Like if you look at, for instance, Alex Jones, who is definitely an occultist. There's no question in my mind that this guy is part of this agenda. He on his live website, he has the word live, but it's mirrored. So it says evil because it's switched. And so this use of palindromes and backward spellings of things is so much part of this occultic network that even our words are suspect that we choose. And it's a frightening thing, because you go, what is safe? But I guess it's all safe as long as you have an understanding of how that works. But and some of it is hard to explain. Like, for instance, when all this came out with 9/11, everything, George Tenet was head of the CIA, and his his name Tenet is a palindrome. It's, frontwards and backwards is the same. Plus, it has the encyclopedic meaning of a philosophy or a dogma.
Right.
Right. And so you go,
truth,
how
right.
how do they do this?
That's very interesting. Let's pause for our network break. You are listening to Sofia Smallstorm on Speed of Light. This is the Pure Momentum Network. And we will be right back with my guest, Zoe, and we'll continue to talk about all this occultic, New Age, elite involvement.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Deborah Taveras of StopTheCrime.net, and I welcome you to Stop the Crime on the Pure Momentum Network. I am committed to exposing the ongoing war being waged not only against all American people, but the entire global population by international central banking cabals and their minions. We will be talking to you about the silent weaponized systems of assaults upon the population, which will help to define what everybody knows: something is terribly wrong. The corporate banking system has created the illusion that we have a legitimate government, and we do not. This corporate structure has gradually taken control of our country's economy, legal system, intelligence, military, scientific, and political operations. Only by understanding your reality will you be able to engage in solutions, and there are solutions. And we must engage. We must help others. We must live in right conduct and not be afraid. Visit us on the Pure Momentum Network and StopTheCrime.net.
An amount necessary or sufficient to have a significant effect or to achieve a result. This is critical mass.
Greetings, fellow organic beings on planet Earth. My name is Pamela Tartar. I host Critical Mass on Pure Momentum Network. My awareness tells me humanity is reaching a tipping point. A choice must be made. Either we choose continuing under ever-worsening tyranny, or we stand up in our humanity and create a new world of love, abundance, compassion, empathy, and all the human attributes and features. I invite you to join me as we explore who we are and find tools inside us, enabling us to stand tall and strong against the opposition. Now is the time. Pamela Tartar, Critical Mass.
Welcome back, everyone, to Speed of Light on Pure Momentum Network. This is Sofia Smallstorm speaking with Zoe. We're continuing our discussion. We had just reached the idea of palindromes, and Zoe had pointed out that the former director of the CIA, George Tenet, his name is a palindrome, and it also is Tenet means kind of a doctrinal sort of philosophy, a holding of some kind in terms of theme and so forth. So that is fascinating. I had never thought of that. And of course, we're aware of a lot of words like love and evil are kind of mirrors of one another. Live and evil. And you had said that Alex Jones has that on his website.
Right, it says live, but backwards it's evil. So, and he uses the Masonic hand signs constantly, as well as a certain cadence to his speech, which they all do. Operation Mockingbird talks about the indoctrination of the media, because you will notice, especially on progressive radio, there's certain cadence, like Tom Hartman. He will always say, and they have kind of these repetitive. David Icke does the same thing. They have these repetitive things that they introduce, and when you become aware of it, it's just odd, because it's not the way people talk. It's definitely a contrived thing that they do, but cadence is very much a part of it. This sort of hypnosis that people are under. But Alex Jones is without a doubt an occultist. And he will
Wow.
admit it. He will admit that, he experimented in these things when he was younger, but he leaves it in the past. But it's really, with him, it's not in the past, because he knows, if anybody should know that our founding fathers were occultists, it should be him. But he does a lot of, chest beating about our founding fathers. Well, they were part of this in such a huge way. And anybody that's got a voice that isn't exposing that, I mean, the fact that most of the signers on the Declaration of Independence were Masons. If this stuff is so good, why is it secret? They say, why not let we bring it out and we'll all talk about it and decide whether we want things to be done in secret, and whether secret societies should play a role in our government and in our entertainment industries. It seems to me that this stuff, because people will tell you, oh, well, occult doesn't mean evil; it means just hidden. Well, why is something hidden? Let's bring it out. Let's look at it. Let's dissect it. Let's decide if this is a good thing.
It's hidden. It's hidden because it has tremendous power and meaning, and those meanings, I think, are incorporated into our lives, and we participate in them in a somewhat oblivious state. Like the pyramid on the dollar bill, the even the whole design of Washington, D.C. I watched a very interesting film called In the Shadow of Hermes by Yuri Lina that talks about the takedown of the Russian Empire. And he does draw extremely clear parallels to how the United States was created, and all by the same Masonic hand that worked to take down, has always worked to take down the empires of the world and create new ones in their place. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, about private meditation, just to roll back a few steps. When a person is meditating in their own room and they're kind of quieting their mind, is that also offering the mind space up to seizure or energy theft of the sort that you were describing earlier?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the person. I think that if you have a higher level conscience and you practice these things in an attempt to I would say connect ethereally with like-minded people that also desire peace and desire compassion, dignity, chastity, positive aspects. I think that it has that effect. But unfortunately, the New Age movement is full of so many toxic people that are using these practices. And if nothing else, the New Age movement has promoted self-indulgence. We're not really here to contemplate our navel and find our personal power. We're here to be in service to other people, I believe. And so I think it comes down to people that are in service to self versus people that are in service to others. And so the answer is that if your intentions are pure, then your meditations are pure, unless you're using a prescribed system like, I'll call out transcendental meditation specifically because I've researched that enough to know that there's nothing good rooted in the rootings of all these things, where they came from and who promoted them.
Well, I know many people who did TM for a while and then they kind of lost interest. Would you say that those experiences have kind of a lasting effect on you?
Yeah, but not forever. I think that if you walk away from it and you tend to be more altruistic in your approach to life and more centered on things other than self, then I think that it all sort of goes by the wayside and loses its impact. If you're a person that is into finding your personal power or wanting like for instance, Reiki. I've never known a Reiki master that wasn't completely screwed up. And I know that I'll get a lot of people ticked off by saying that, but I've never met people that are entrenched deeply into these things that are living happy, healthy, vibrant life. And what I get from a lot of people, if I talk about these things, is, well, why do you have to be so negative? You have to find joy in your life. And these are people that are completely joyless that are telling me this. And I have a million things in my life that I get joy from. I'm a musician. I love to garden. I love to cook. I enjoy life to its fullest. But what happens is when you hit people over the head with facts, like especially, well, you take like somebody like Aleister Crowley, and people in the New Age movement will tell you, oh, he's so misunderstood. Well, then go frickin' read his book on child rape and child ritual, sexual ritual, and see if you want to keep that deck of tarot cards on your living room table. I mean, they don't do the research, but when you hit them over the head with the facts, then they turn on you and say, why do you have to be so negative? And it's like, I don't have this guy's cards on my table, and I wouldn't,
Let's go back to when you were very small and being duck walked down the hall. So you left the present when you saw the bulletin board, and that was an effort to shield yourself from what was to come.
Right.
And can you tell us at all what you think happened in those times, those, hours? And then I think you were returned to the, whatever it was, music class or something. And this apparently is on all over America, right?
Right. And it's typical. I was involved in sexual ritual, using fear tactics like, animal sacrifice and stuff like that to guarantee the silence because the amount of fear. And what was amazing to me is that I was a very, very neurotic child, but nobody knew it. I mean, I knew enough to not tell people or express the fears that I was feeling, but I lived my life absolutely petrified. And you look at home movies or whatever, and I'm looking pretty normal, but I know what was happening in my brain, and I was as far from normal as you could get. And it manifested into, kind of neurotic tendencies as I was growing up, over focus on cleanliness and, just a lot of being afraid of everything. I was scared to death of dogs. I was scared to death dark. I was scared to be alone. I was scared to be on in a high place. I was scared of heights. I was scared of everything. And, when you get worked over the coals in the way that I was later in life, as I started to expose this, I lost all my fear. And I have to say that was the best thing that ever happened, to let go of being, because when I woke up in the creek and I knew I was supposed to be dead, there was almost a flippant attitude. It's like, okay, I see what's happening. Screw you. You can't touch me. I've got divine protection. And so I approached my life, because there were repercussions when I came here to my sister's house. Usually what happens with people that have gone through this, they're targeted individuals, is they're making these claims about black helicopters and being followed or whatever, but there's no substantiation. But these people were helping me out because I was being followed by black helicopters. I would pick up my sister's kids, one of them in Cerritos every afternoon and the other one 30 miles away. And every time I got to their schools at exactly that moment, 2 black helicopters would fly over the parking lot. And I didn't want to scare the kids, so I didn't say anything. They eventually said to me, hey, what's up with the black helicopters?
So you think this was because of you? They would actually dispatch 2 black helicopters?
Yeah, and that's, people would say it, like my dad, when my sister was pretty clever about exposing this to the rest of the family. She did the research, like I said, from the actual documents about MKUltra, and she wrote up a 2-page article, because she used to send off things to the Pasadena Star News. They printed everything that she ever wrote, except for the article about MKUltra. They just totally overlooked that one. But she sent it to family members, and it didn't have anything to do with me. It was about what she read from the documents. And she emailed everybody in my family, and she said, can you believe that they would do this? And without exception, they all emailed back, of course we believe they did it. So then she waited a few days, and she goes, well, guess what? They did it to me. And then they're all, that's nonsense. Oh, that's, she's crazy, blah, blah, blah. But they would believe that they would do it, but not to me. And I had a conversation with my father when I tried to explain some things about how my life was set up. And he says, well, you're not that important. And I mean, that's the biggest slap in the face. It's like, I'm a lab rat. A lab rat's not important, any more important than the next rat. But if you're part of an experiment, then you're part of an experiment. It didn't have to do with, he said that there was no way they would devote that kind of time. But when you're a targeted individual, you got to understand these people have all the money in the world. They use gang stalking. They use all these techniques. And that's what makes it so unbelievable is that people go, well, they wouldn't put all those resources into doing that. You're not important. You know, who are you in the world that they would expend all of this energy and money and time on? Well, you're a targeted individual. And they admit that they do this. But if you are one, then it's very few of the people around you that will say, well, yeah, you are. But they helped me out in that. Plus, I had a lot of anecdotal evidence. Like if I can go into a little bit of my history, like when I was in college, I mentioned the Watergate, but to be more specific, what happened is my other sister, not the one I live with here, but my other sister mentioned that she had a friend that I'm going to call her Deborah. That's not her name, but she had a friend, Deborah, that had a friend that owned a clothing boutique. And she wanted to know if I could use some small size clothing because he was going out of business and he had all these clothes that were brand new off the rack, but he couldn't use them. So, you know, I was kind of a flower child. I was going to the University of Maryland and I was involved in the anti-war effort and all these different movements. And so it wasn't really my style, but it was free. They brought over a whole van load of clothing with the tags still on. And it wasn't really my style, but like I said, it was free. So what the heck, I took all these clothes. So then a couple days later, Deborah said that her friend also owned the Watergate jewelry store, and they were looking for somebody to work there. Well, at 18, I don't question why I'm being asked to work at the Watergate. Is it based on my vast knowledge of jewels or my customer service background? I mean, you just go, oh, like a job? Okay, fine, I'll take it. And so I went to work there. I was there for 3 days. And on the third day, when I walked in, he handed me a cup of coffee, the owner, and I started to drink that, and I started to feel a little strange. And he said, well, I won't be needing you anymore. And I said, you won't be needing me anymore? And that's all he would say. He said it 3 times, I won't be needing you anymore. So I was starting to get very disoriented, which I understand now I was drugged. At the time, I used to call that disoriented. I was tripping my brains out. So I walked across the Watergate complex to the bus stop because it was too expensive to park there. So I had taken the bus in, and I'm standing at the bus stop, and this brown BMW drives up, and it's this guy that's living in my parents' house in suburban Maryland. My parents were living in San Salvador, and I was staying downstairs while I went to the University of Maryland, and there was another CIA couple that was living upstairs. And so it's 35 miles from where I lived, and it's not on the way. Again, he had to specifically drive there. So this guy that lived in my house, he pulls up, the passenger door opens, and he says to me, you'll be needing a ride now. So I got in the car, and the next thing I knew, it was 2 weeks later, rather, and I'm landing in San Salvador, and I've got my parents' address written down, and they weren't expecting me. Nobody knows how I got a passport, but my passport shows I went everywhere. I was in Jamaica and Haiti and Dominican Republic, all over the place, and I just end up in San Salvador and took a cab to my parents' house. And the weird part is that how they reacted to those situations, it was always like, well, this is another mess Zoe got herself into. But I mean, if it were my kid, I would like to know, well, where did you get the money? How did you get a passport? What have you been doing for the past 2 weeks? But these things were just like ignored. And it's a mystery as far as how complicit my parents were, whether they were mind controlled, I don't know. But during that time that I was missing in action, the Watergate break-in took place. And the girl, Deborah, that set this whole thing up was murdered along with her husband in a satanic-style slaying. And I've done research since then and found out that the Vatican owned the Watergate. They built the Watergate, and that there was a huge amount of sex trafficking going on during the time of the Watergate break-in, which was one of the main things they were trying to cover up. And so, you know, it became about a burglary, but it was about way more than a burglary.
This is very weird, don't you think?
Yes, it is. And then after that, like I said, you know, I have anecdotal evidence that unfortunately most people that have gone through these things, all they can say is, you know, they're trying to get me. Or I had one girl that was trying to convince me that she was targeted because a woman came up to her in Safeway and said, don't get that cheese. And she thought that was like concrete evidence that she was a targeted individual, because And she was, but she had been driven nuts to the point that she couldn't coherently express things. But because I had these anecdotal things in my life to talk to my sister about, she scratched her head and she said, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Just like when I dropped out of school because I was approached by somebody with a social research agency that wanted me to start a word processing service bureau in his suite. He did a lot of government contracts for HEW and all these different alphabet agencies that are in Rockville, Maryland, right outside of D.C. And the bids for these contracts were very time sensitive. At that time, people would actually be in cabs with whiteout and a secretary on the way down to submit it, changing figures as they went. It was very competitive. And so he wanted somebody to be right there with a word processing service bureau so that he could get these documentations done and these proposals written. So I'm there in his suites in Rockville for a month, and I don't have a business card. I don't have a brochure, never made a phone call. But within 1 month, my clients were the World Bank, the United Nations, CMP Telephone Company, ComSat Laboratories. I could go on and on and on and on. And, it makes absolutely no sense. I don't think I could get those contracts now, even though I'm a lot smarter now than I was then. So these businesses, I was set up in these businesses. And at that time, we had a contract with CMP Telephone Company. I mentioned before that the post office was sort of like the Google of the time in terms of information gathering. Well, CMP Telephone Company, they had like buildings all over DC. They had 10-story marketing department, and they had like 22 of the word processing units that my company had. But we did all the work, and we went there every day and picked up stacks of work. And there was just all these people sitting around with these expensive computers doing absolutely nothing. And so I think that my business was somehow part of this information tracing and databasing format that got its footing back in those days. Although I can't really say how, but I do know that it was obviously a setup because they built a business up, and then I lost 75% of that business within 2 days. People started calling the World Bank and said, well, we're going to do this out of Geneva now. And, one by one in a 2-day period, all the contracts disappeared, followed by the IRS coming in to do a full in-house desk audit for a week, disallowing all these deductions. So they built it up and they took it down.
So how old were you? You said you had dropped out of college when this began, this business thing. So you were college age, right?
Yeah, I was like 21.
And then it continued for how long?
Well, all my life, because
No. I'm just trying to separate out the different phases of your life. So the business continued for how long?
That was started, I would think, around 76, and then in 82, I moved out west, and so because when they went through the audit, they assessed all these ridiculous fines, and I had a good accountant who said, well, this is bogus, it's ridiculous, you need a tax attorney. So I went to a tax attorney, but they wanted to shake me down for more than the IRS was demanding. So my better bet was to start paying the IRS. So I had this incredible shrinking business where I just laid people off and eventually moved the equipment to my house. But I had some long-term leases, for equipment that, because of the expansion with the amount of business that was coming in. I mean, I bought all kinds of equipment. And
so did you had no experience running a business, but this business built up very rapidly, and it was obviously flush. You were getting so much work. So did you have any difficulty running it?
Well, initially, yes, because what happened was the accounts were coming in unsolicited. I mean, the World Bank to call and say, can we come see you? And they want, this is like the World Bank and the United Nations. And there's no way that I could get those accounts that I had. They wanted us to do their monthly operations summary out of my little offices in Rockville, which, looking back, it makes no sense because there were people that were getting into word processing that had backgrounds and connections and all these things. I had none of those things. I was approached by somebody and they said, hey, I'll give you this suite in my offices if you will give me priority service. And from there, for me to have the, ComSat Laboratories, CMP Telephone Company, I don't know that we covered CMP Telephone Company before we got caught off. did I talk about CNP Telephone Company before the cutoff?
No, we were briefly cut off. So
Okay. Okay, because we had a contract with CNP Telephone Company to do all this work, and CNP Telephone Company was kind of like the Google of the times. You know, I mentioned the post office being a hub for the mechanization and the track tracing and databasing of that day. Well, Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company in D.C., they had no reason to have a 10-story marketing department filled with equipment that wasn't being used. We were doing all of the documentation, and I would deliver papers to them every day while I watched all of these people supposedly that worked there sitting around doing nothing. And at that time, the word processing equipment that we used was called Videc, and it was very expensive. It was like $16,000 in a unit, and their offices were filled with them, but they were never turned on. And so, you know, the why of it doesn't make any sense. I'll never figure out, you know, why it was, because it wasn't sensitive information that we were doing for CMP. We also had contracts with like Watkins Johnson Engineering. We also had contracts with the litigation company that was involved in the Watergate litigation that was happening at the time. So we had, you know, sensitive, like high exposure type of clients and jobs with no reasonable explanation of how we got them, because I knew nothing about running a business at all, and had no background nor desire even to do it. It's something that was more or less set up. And what happened was I lost all of the contracts within a 2-day period. One by one, they called and said, well, we're doing the World Bank thing out of Geneva now, and Watkins Johnson canceled their program, and on and on and on. So in 2 days, I lost 75% of my business, followed by an in-house 1-week IRS audit where they were sitting in my desk for over a week. And I had an accountant, and they disallowed all these legitimate deductions. And she said, you need a tax attorney. This is bogus. So I got a tax attorney, but he wanted more than the IRS. He was shaking me down for more. My best bet was to start paying them. So they basically ruined that business. I saw it through to the end. I had lease purchases on the equipment. The equipment was worth nothing. It was like ballast at the end of the lease purchase, but I saw it through.
Let me ask you this. You actually mean to say that in all those big companies where they had all that fancy equipment, it was never being used in all these departments that could have easily been doing the work that you were being contracted?
No question about it. No question about it. It was ridiculous because Watkins Johnson would send us over. We charged a rate based on per page. And they would send us over like 500 sheets that had 2 words on a page. They were like title pages, like said, number 2, schematics. And it was like back in those days, ka-ching, $3.50 every time we generated a 2-word page, you know, so you could rack it up. And so we were making tremendous amounts of money, but we were also having to expand, you know, which was part of the deal, I believe, to, you know, because I signed on the dotted line for like $100,000 worth of equipment through Chase Manhattan. And back then there was Washington was not as padded as you would think during that recession. And so the interest rate was 18% on this equipment, which, you know, by the end of the 5-year lease purchase, with the advances being made, was worth absolutely zero at the end of the lease purchase. But,
okay, well, we're closing our first hour now. We're coming to the end of the first of a 2-hour show. And I'm really grateful to you, Zoe, for this very interesting history. I would urge everyone to please come back to the other side. Join us in the members section for the second hour, where we're going to continue. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more from Zoe and her, if she has any memories. I mean, I'd like you to explain a little more about whether you had memories of what happened in childhood or not, and then tell us a little more about the industries involved in all this in an active way. I mean, you mentioned these companies that didn't do anything, gave you all the accounts. So thank you again. This is Sofia Smallstorm conducting hour 1 of my interview with Zoe, and I invite you to join us on the other side for the second hour in the members section at Pure Momentum Network, PureMomentum.net.
We invite all our listeners to join us in the members section for the second hour of all our shows. We encourage you to click on the subscribe button, choose a membership type, pay with PayPal, and voila, you're a member. Enjoy all Pure Momentum Network material, the second hour of all talk shows, extra interviews, and all